Yugoslavia, one of Europe's most complex nations and one of its largest. From 1918 until the 1980s, it was a diverse European power player, home to countless internal conflicts as well as cultural influences that spread over much of Europe. And today, it simply no longer exists. In its place is a complex network of smaller countries, each with its own political system and ethnic conflicts. And to get here, it took one of the bloodiest internal conflicts in Europe since the Second World War. Why did Yugoslavia actually break up? And does the story of the breakup of this nation hold any lessons for any other divided nations? To find out, we have to go back, way back. The origins of Yugoslavia starts with the history of the South Slavs, a European ethnic group primarily living in the Balkans. They were initially referred to as the Illyrians, after a pre-Slavic Balkan people who lived in the same regions, and their affairs were usually overseen by local monarchs who divided the territory among themselves. But as time went on and the 19th century dawned, the South Slavs looked among themselves and saw the many independence movements and revolutions taking place and then started to wonder, why not us? At this time, the Principality of Serbia was the most powerful group among the South Slavs, having an autonomous government. In 1848, a group backed by the government first created the idea of a South Slavic federation, and soon aligned with the neighboring Croats. Leaders of these two groups met to hash out the details of what would become Yugoslavia, a country uniting the identities of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes into a single unit. This was the 1800s, so it's not surprising that the ideal government envisioned was a monarchy led by a traditional king. But the king would be backed by a ministry and assembly with representatives from all the tribes. Each tribe would be allowed to manage its own internal affairs, keep its own language, and have its own religion, as the South Slavs were heavily divided between Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians. They created a plan, and then they waited. Independence movements weren't an easy thing to start up in Europe, and the Ottoman Empire was incredibly powerful at the time. With its capital in Istanbul, this empire kept a tight grip on the Balkans until the 19th century started coming to an end, and other countries started asserting themselves. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878 saw a decisive defeat for the Ottomans as other countries in the region became stronger. One of those was Serbia, the only independent nation in what would become Yugoslavia at the time, and they were ready to make their move. But it would take a much bigger crisis for Yugoslavia to become a reality. As World War I ripped across Europe, just about everyone was caught in the middle. Serbia was aligned with Russia and later Great Britain and the United States. In fact, Serbia kicked off the conflict when freedom fighter Gavrilo Princip assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So they had a lot to lose and a lot to gain. While Europe was at war, the Yugoslav Committee met for the first time, carving out a proposal for the aftermath of the war that would divide Austria and Hungary into separate nations and also create a third kingdom, Yugoslavia. It was rejected by the powers that be, but this was only the beginning of the fight, and Europe was about to be redrawn. And nothing makes it easier to create a new nation than the aftermath of a war. The Habsburg Empire of Austria-Hungary had taken control of the region in the wake of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and that empire was now being dissolved at the conclusion of World War I. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and other forces on their side faced harsh reprisals for the war, and that included loss of territory. By now, the Serbian parliament in exile had issued a statement in favor of the creation of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which had been renamed the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. If that sounds like a complicated name, it's nothing compared to the new country's politics. When a pro-unity national council took control in Zagreb, Croatia in 1918, the city quickly descended into chaos. The Serbian military, the strongest of the powers, was asked to come in and restore order. It did, and the forming of Yugoslavia was well underway. Tensions were high, as many feared Serbia would simply annex the other countries. Negotiations were undertaken, and soon the kingdom was formally declared. The country would soon annex several other areas including Montenegro and Bosnia and Herzegovina, the latter of which had large Muslim populations. This would set up a future for the country heavily defined by ethnic divisions. Could a country as diverse as this one become unified? Outlook cloudy. In the early days of the state of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, power was divided. A national assembly was led by Croat politician Stepan Radic, while the head of state was Serbian King Alexander I. This created an uneasy balance of powers as separatist movements continued to cause chaos. It wouldn't be long before things boiled over, as only 10 years after the founding of the kingdom, Radic would be assassinated by a radical Serb politician along with 2 other deputies. The country plunged into chaos, and the king thought he had the solution. Wouldn't this country work a lot smoother if there wasn't all this democracy red tape? To quell the chaos, Alexander eliminated the constitution, banned all political powers, and took all the power for himself as he tried to shut down sectarian violence once and for all. He renamed the country Yugoslavia as a way to stress unity and imposed a new constitution on the country. Despite this, he didn't want to be an absolute dictator and set up his own exit from power by 1931. He remained the king but transitioned the country back to a split system of government. It looked like things in Yugoslavia might finally be calming down. Good thing nothing big happened in Europe in the 1930s, right? The new power was just beginning to establish itself when Europe slipped into upheaval again, and much of Yugoslavia's future would be heavily determined by larger powers for the next half-century. In the Soviet Union, the internally focused Vladimir Lenin had been replaced by the more ambitious and ruthless Joseph Stalin, who was aligned with the Serbs and was looking to export communism around the world. Meanwhile, in Germany, resentment over the country's loss in World War I and the aftermath had given the Nazi movement the momentum they needed to start imposing fascism on their country, something that was also happening in Italy, where Benito Mussolini was taking control. None of these new autocratic leaders had any use for Alexander I. But Alexander wasn't going to give up power easily. According to Alexander, the source of Yugoslavia's weakness was its disunity, and he believed he could fix that. Historic regions were abolished, towns and rivers were renamed, and separatist politicians were arrested. Seeing the Soviet Union as the most pressing threat, Alexander cracked down on communist ideas, but that might have led him to ignore the most direct threats to his life. In the Croatian regions of Yugoslavia, Nazi sympathizers were growing in number, and that formed into the Ustaše, one of the most brutal fascist movements of the era. Along with Macedonian separatist movements, they plotted against the king, and on a visit to France in 1934, Alexander I was gunned down, bringing an end to Yugoslavia's first king, and his replacement might not have been up to the task. Peter II had been born for the role, as the son of Alexander I. But there was just one problem. He was only 11 years old as the march to World War II was building. He took control, but the government was largely guided by his cousin, Prince Paul, as regent. The problem with a regency is who is actually in charge. While Yugoslavia wasn't actually at the center of the conflict in the 1930s, the new country was a hotly desired piece of real estate. The fascist governments of Germany and Italy started making inroads, boosting Croatian independence hopes. Croatia was given autonomy in 1939, with the region still staying part of Yugoslavia. Prince Paul was a weak leader and easily pressured, and in 1941 he agreed to sign the Tripartite Pact, which would make Yugoslavia an official part of the Axis powers. The war was about to come home. Backed by the British, the army staged a coup against Paul, ended the regency, and declared the still 17-year-old King Peter an adult. The young king took control, at least until days later when Hitler ordered the invasion of Yugoslavia in response to the coup. World War II had officially hit a new country, and it would be the beginning of the end for a brief period of stability. The German Air Force brutally bombed Belgrade and other major cities, and it would only take 11 days before Yugoslavia signed an armistice that allowed the Axis powers to occupy it. The new country was quickly carved up, with Croatia becoming an independent Nazi state ruled by the Ustaše. The Germans also took over Bosnia and Herzegovina, while Bulgaria, Hungary, and Italy split the rest. Axis occupation was always terrible, but one group had it the worst. The Ustaše quickly gained a reputation as one of the most brutal groups ever seen in Europe, with the sadistic Nazi-aligned militia immediately launching a campaign of genocide not just against the Jews and Roma, the usual Nazi targets, but against the Serbs. It's estimated that at least 300,000 Serbs were killed by the Ustaše. Unlike the Nazis, the Ustaše also believed in the supremacy of the Roman Catholic religion and engaged in campaigns of mass conversion. Reportedly, Hitler was occasionally disturbed by the Ustaše's zeal for murder, but hey, they were useful, but they weren't unopposed. The Yugoslav resistance was brutally hunted down during this period but never stopped fighting. They were split into two groups, the Chetniks, who were royalists and largely pro-Serbian. The Yugoslav partisans, meanwhile, were a communist movement, and when Hitler backstabbed Stalin and invaded Russia, they suddenly became very important. They were led by Josip Broz, a communist revolutionary who would become an increasingly powerful figure in the country. He led a guerrilla campaign that would soon turn into the largest resistance army in the occupied parts of Europe. When the partisans began to look like the more powerful army, the Chetniks attempted to cozy up to the Axis powers, but it was clear who was winning this conflict. And in the aftermath of World War II, the map would change once again. The Yugoslav partisans were one of the most successful resistance groups in Europe, forming their own anti-fascist council in 1942 and successfully expelling the Axis from Serbia in 1944. While the Red Army provided assistance, the heavy lifting was left up to the partisans, and the Axis occupation of Yugoslavia fell in 1945. The country was united again, and the Allies had been victorious, which meant the future of the country would be heavily determined by the victorious European powers. Great Britain's diminished stature and the United States' heavy involvement in the Pacific theater meant the Soviet Union had outsized influence here, and between that and Josip Broz's success leading the partisans, it was pretty clear which faction would win out. And so Josip Broz, who was commonly known as Tito, became the first communist leader of Yugoslavia. Renamed the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia, the new leadership was quick to depose the young king and eliminate opposition elements. While Yugoslavia was once again united, it became a collection of 6 republics under a central government: the Socialist Republics of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. Serbia had 2 autonomous regions as well, Kosovo and Vojvodina. This new formation brought the shape of Yugoslavia closer to what it looks like today as independent nations, and so began a new era for Yugoslavia, one that would put the conflicts on pause. Tito was a highly ambitious leader and thought he could expand into Albania and start a civil war in Greece with the help of communist Bulgaria. Stalin was not a fan of this idea, and tensions between communist Yugoslavia and the USSR started to rise. While the two were part of Europe's communist movement, Yugoslavia was not going to be a simple satellite state. As countless members of the German minority of Yugoslavia were expelled, Tito set out to revamp Yugoslavia's constitution once again. His biggest break from Stalin came when he asked for American aid, something Stalin and the countries in his sphere rejected. Refusing to formally align with either the Eastern Bloc or the newly founded NATO, Tito aligned with India and other powers to create the non-aligned movement. But after around 10 years, Tito thought it was probably time for another name change. In 1963, the name of the country was changed once again to the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and Tito was given the title of President for life. While each of the regions were given some level of autonomy and had their own government, Tito controlled the larger politics of the country and ruled it with an iron fist. Many of his rivals were part of mysterious accidents, which eliminated them as a political threat. However, as time went on, cracks began to form in Tito's authoritarian regime. Mass student protests led to Tito grudgingly granting more rights to the people and more autonomy to the republics, and that allowed Tito to continue to rule the country until his death in 1980. While he was an authoritarian leader and would often brutally repress his political enemies, he was seen as less brutal than Soviet-aligned leaders, and he had successfully been able to contain the country's ethnic conflicts. And now that he was gone, there was a power vacuum left in his place. In the aftermath of Tito's death, there was no figure well set up to assume the role of president for life. He had made sure that, instead, the presidents of Yugoslavia were appointed for one-year terms, with the role shifting between the various ethnic groups. Despite that, there were increased ethnic tensions as the post-World War II ban on nationalism started to be relaxed. Many Croats felt that the Serbs had outsized influence in Yugoslavia despite Tito being of Croatian descent. The new constitution of 1974 was seen by Serbia as giving too many concessions to the Croats and ethnic Albanian minority groups, and seen by those groups as not going far enough. The growing Albanian independence movement in Kosovo, which could not legally separate from Yugoslavia, was also causing attention. It was all the recipe for disaster. In the 1980s, Yugoslavia was one of the fastest-growing countries in the world, but was also plagued by economic instability. In 1989 alone, almost 100,000 workers were laid off, and where economic instability goes, government instability follows. The many weak leaders who followed Tito were not up to the task of quelling the protests or alleviating the economic crisis, and independence movements started to grow, nowhere more than in Serbia. While his power had been minimized in recent years, Serbian communist leader Slobodan Milosevic saw an opening to try to grab back the power that Serbia had held before 1974 and potentially make himself the new power broker in Yugoslavia. Aligned with Montenegro and controlling the votes in Kosovo and Vojvodina after moves to reduce their sovereignty, Milosevic now held 4 of the 8 votes in the Yugoslav Council and was close to seizing control of the country itself. And that would kick off Yugoslavia's final crisis as an independent nation. A massive miners' strike in Kosovo in protest of the changes led to heavy ethnic conflict between Albanians and other groups in the region, and other republics in Yugoslavia started to turn away from Milosevic's influence. Slovenia and Croatia came out in favor of Kosovo's demands, and the conflict between Serbs and other Slavs and Albanians threatened to unravel the entire republic. Milosevic turned to military force to suppress the Kosovo protests, and the next meeting of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia descended into chaos as the Slovene and Croatian delegations walked out. This was an era where communism was declining in influence across Europe, with many Soviet-aligned states falling and the USSR itself on its last legs. And so Yugoslavia began to go its own way, peacefully, but that wouldn't last. Each of the republics began holding their own elections, with Slovenia and Croatia rejecting communist rule. Serbia, meanwhile, saw its communist government keep power and began to plan for sanctions against other countries. As secession movements built, ethnic conflict within each republic ramped up again, this time with Serb loyalists and other republics trying to secede. It was 1990 when this boiled over into open conflict, as new governments tried to replace Yugoslav military forces with their own pro-independent soldiers. The Serbian-dominated Yugoslav government stepped up aggression. In most areas this was limited, but not in one region. And so, the Yugoslav wars had begun. Attempts were made to diffuse tensions, with Slovenia and Croatia proposing turning Yugoslavia into a confederation of independent nations. Milosevic immediately rejected this and was met with massive protests in Serbia, and immediately unleashed the police and military, who used lethal force to disperse protesters. It wasn't long before Serbian loyalists started causing chaos in other countries as well. In March 1991 in Croatia, the Croatian police clashed with the Serbian-aligned Yugoslavian military. While the military was ostensibly neutral, most officers were Serbian, and their loyalty was becoming clear. The situation was untenable, and in June of that same year, Slovenia and Croatia formally declared independence. And soon the clashes escalated into a country-wide conflict. The Yugoslavian Council ordered the army to restore the recognized borders, and invasions of both Slovenia and Croatia began. While the Slovenian War only lasted 10 days before a ceasefire was brokered, the Croatian War of Independence would last much longer and would be bloodier. The international community urged the two states to put a hold on their independence, but it wouldn't last. By the fall of 1991, Croatia would be enmeshed in a full civil war as ethnic Serbs attempted to break away and join Serbia. The chaos wouldn't stop there. Macedonia declared independence as well, and with Serbia so occupied by Croatia, they were able to break away from Yugoslavia without conflict. But the conflict was about to spread. In November, the Serbian population in Bosnia held a referendum that voted to stay with Serbia, but the government rejected it as a sham referendum. With each side boycotting the other's referendum, the official government referendum voted for independence, and the Serbian government responded by recognizing the independence of a Serbian state within Bosnia. This would kick off the Bosnian War, the bloodiest conflict in the entire collapse of Yugoslavia. With Croatia backing the newly independent Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia backing the breakaway state, it would become a proxy war for the entire former Yugoslavia, and this left Serbia with only one reliable ally. The states of Serbia and Montenegro, both of whom were relatively untouched by the chaos, voted to unify and create the new Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. With Milosevic a major power player in the state and eventually its leader, this new country attempted to cast itself as the legitimate successor to the Cold War-era socialist Yugoslavia, and it would play a key role in keeping the Yugoslav wars going. The wars would continue for almost 4 years until the Dayton Agreement was signed, putting an end to the conflict. It recognized the independence of Croatia and Slovenia while also agreeing to Bosnia and Herzegovina becoming a single state divided between its two ethnic regions. It was seen as a valuable step forward, but one that didn't solve the inherent problems and ignored the war crimes and ethnic cleansing that took place during the war. But the conflict in the region was far from over. As details of the Yugoslav wars came to light, it became clear that Slobodan Milosevic had been responsible for extensive atrocities, using supposed threats towards Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina to persecute and murder ethnic Albanians. But his crimes largely slipped under the radar at first, and the Dayton Agreement put an end to the conflict, so Milosevic turned his eyes internally to the region of Kosovo, a heavily Albanian region of Serbia with a strong independence movement. The Kosovo Liberation Army, a rebel group formed in the early 1990s to fight against Serbian oppression, had now become more ambitious and sought to unify Kosovo with Albania. It had been targeting Serbian law enforcement starting in 1995, and attacks increased into a full-fledged insurgency backed by weapons smuggled from Albania. And the rebellion was about to be turned into a full war. By 1998, the KLA had begun large-scale attacks against Yugoslavian authorities, and Serbian forces responded by targeting not just KLA fighters but sympathizers, pro-Kosovo politicians, and large numbers of ethnic Kosovar Albanians. Soon, thousands of civilians were dead, and over 300,000 Kosovar Albanians had been displaced. It was clear this wasn't just an internal conflict, it was turning into one of the worst atrocities the world had seen in Europe since the Second World War, and it was about to get worse. In 1999, Yugoslav forces began a massive expulsion and terror campaign against the Albanian population. When an attempt at a peace deal failed, NATO made the decision to launch a humanitarian war against the Serbian government's assault on Kosovo. This would be a brief war, with NATO having the overwhelming number advantage, but not actively seeking to topple the Yugoslav government led by Milosevic. After a little over 2 months, the NATO forces triumphed and the Yugoslav forces retreated, and it became clear just how brutal the Serbian campaign in Kosovo had been. Milosevic would ultimately be charged with war crimes, the only European leader to ever face trial at The Hague. Although he would die before his trial was concluded, and Kosovo would gain independence, mostly. Although the country's independence is recognized by most of the world, it does not have a full UN membership due to Russia's dogged opposition. And today, Yugoslavia is a distant memory. The collection of republics that made up the large country are now all independent nations, and even Serbia and Montenegro have split. Tensions remain high between Serbia and Kosovo, although border skirmishes have not developed into full conflict again. Nowadays, the 7 states that succeeded Yugoslavia each manage their own affairs, with Serbia being still closely aligned with Russia, and Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia being members of NATO. Bosnia and Herzegovina is more of a wild card, not tightly aligned with either faction as European conflict starts raging again. But many people still wonder, could Yugoslavia have been saved? Yugoslavia is far from the only country to be heavily divided between ethnic groups. The current conflict in Ukraine is partially due to the presence of Russian-speaking minorities in the east. At least that's what Putin claims. While there are some pockets of Russian sympathizers there, every region of the country voted to become independent in the initial referendum, even Crimea. And solidarity against Russia has only increased since the war began. In most countries, ethnic tensions color things, but people are loyal to their country first and foremost. So, what went wrong with Yugoslavia? For one thing, it's all in a name. It was originally created as a unifying country for Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. But while they had their unifying factor of all being Slavs, the decisions were there from the start and only deepened when the Albanian population grew. With 3 major religions present in the country, namely Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and Islam, divisions ran deep and frequently boiled over into conflict. And if there was a chance for a unified Yugoslav identity, it didn't have time to develop. Yugoslavia only existed as an independent nation for a little over 70 years, and in that time, it was rarely a master of its own fate. The initial few decades of the country's existence saw a king attempting to unify the country under one banner by force if need be. But soon, Yugoslavia became just another pawn in the Axis powers' quest to conquer Europe. It would then be transformed again, falling under the first Soviet sphere of influence and then under the thrall of a charismatic dictator as it became a socialist state. This means whether it had a king or a fascist occupier or a socialist dictator, Yugoslavia's fate was always determined by an autocrat. And when things changed, all the decades of ethnic tension and frustration with the system of government boiled over with little to no chance of fixing things before they fell apart. And the result was years of change. The Yugoslav wars and the following Kosovo War caused a terrible toll on the region, but there is one upside to the story. These countries began the quest for Yugoslavia as constituent states of empires, with only one having independence. Today, they are 7 thriving nations in the Balkans, each in charge of its own destiny. They gained their independence, but not as a single unit. However, the odds are that this would not have been possible without their unity as a single, massive, powerful nation named Yugoslavia. Want to know just how bad the Yugoslav wars were? Check out Which Country is Guilty of Committing the Worst War Crimes in History for the tale of the tape. Or watch Catholic versus Orthodox. What's the difference between religions for how faith might have influenced this conflict?